Well, welcome everyone. My name is Roland Paris, Director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and on behalf of the school and the Center for International Policy Studies, I want to welcome everyone to this workshop on saving the furniture, which elements of the multilateral system must be sustained, and how. That is co-sponsored by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, and the Navigator Project, a global consortium of researchers that my colleague from NUPI, Ole Jakob Sending, will tell you about in a few moments. Before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge, as we do at the beginning of such events, that this meeting is taking place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I'd also like to thank all our participants and also all of you and everyone who's watching online for joining us today. We're meeting at what seems to be a remarkable moment in history as the so-called rules-based international order, that constellation of institutions and rules and alliances that the United States largely created in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that expanded to encompass much of the earth after the end of the Cold War, seems to be crumbling almost before our eyes. For countries like members of the European Union and Canada, which have long defined themselves as defenders of international institutions and rules, it is, to say the least, a troubling and disorienting time. But our task today is not to lament what's happening, although it might be worth lamenting, or to express the hope that things will somehow return to normal, whatever that means. Rather, it is to accept that these changes are occurring and to consider the practical question of what to do about it. Which elements of the order might be salvageable? Where should countries like Canada and members of the EU focus their limited resources? And how should they do so? The metaphor we chose was one of a house on fire where only some of the furniture can be saved. But in a way, this metaphor is lacking because in some cases, maybe existing structures can be adapted or reformed or rethought, and even new ones created. Even if these new ones or replacement ones might be second best, or for that matter, third best. Our starting point, in other words, is one of sober realism about the world that's quickly emerging. And although it's a distressing topic, it's a vitally important topic, and we have a terrific group of people here to discuss these difficult questions. Now, before handing the mic over to my friend Ole Jakob, let me just make a few brief procedural announcements. First is that this entire workshop is on the record, and indeed most of the sessions are being recorded and webcast live, with the exception of the plenary discussion just before lunch. Second, there is coffee and tea available. You would have seen that at the back of the room. It'll be there and refreshed all day, so please don't hesitate to stand up and help yourselves during the sessions. And a lunch will be served for all the participants and registered members of the audience. Third, there are bathrooms very close to this one. It's just outside this room. There's a hall, and it's just to the right of the stairway. You'll see the entrance to the bathrooms there. Fourth, the microphones at the table around you, you'll have to press the button to turn on the microphone, and when you're done, please turn it off, or else we're going to have feedback in the room. In terms of the agenda, our day is divided into two sections. In the morning, we'll talk about how to go about deciding what's essential to protect or to adapt or to rebuild in a different form. In other words, how should we be thinking about this problem? And how should governments make decisions about where to focus their efforts? First, we'll hear from one of Canada's leading international affairs thinkers and practitioners, Senator Peter Beam. Then we'll turn to a panel of experts to consider the same question. And after a break, we'll have a plenary discussion where participants will be invited to propose their own priorities and to debate the priorities put forward by our previous speakers, as well as strategies for maintaining or reforming key elements of the multilateral system. In the afternoon, We will zero in on two issues that are among the focus themes of the Navigator project. First, the international arrangements for governing trade, tax, and finance, and secondly, the mechanisms for addressing climate change. So with that, let me thank you again for attending, and now I'd like to invite Ole Jakob Sending from NUPI to offer a few words of welcome.
Good morning. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and here also then in my capacity as leading one of the research streams on the Navigator project. First of all, thank you so much to Roland and the University of Ottawa for organizing this workshop. I have never seen, I think, a process of such professional organizing and put together a great team of participants and speakers. So thank you so much for doing that. We really, really appreciate it. I should also thank the European Commission that funds the Navigator project. We are now more than 2 years into the project, and in a minute I'll share some of the broad contours of the research that we are doing and that I think will be of some interest to the discussion today. I think having this discussion about the future of the multilateral system here in Ottawa and with European colleagues is a very good space to have it, because Canada has for a very long time supported the multilateral system much in the same way that European countries have, and we find ourselves now in a context where a lot of the assumptions on which foreign policies and support for that system are being changed. And just today, in an hour, there will be an emergency meeting in the UN Security Council called for by Estonia after the incursions of Russian fighter jets just last week. That raises, of course, the question of the role of the UN Security Council and how much it actually can contribute to diffusing tensions and staking out a path forward. Now, the Navigator project starts from the view that in order to assess the multilateral system, it is useful to think of two aspects that are important. One is effectiveness, and this of course touches on issues of how many actors are in the room when you make decisions. We've seen over time now the emergence of club formats and smaller ad hoc constellations. So that's one aspect, the effectiveness of governance systems within the multilateral system. The other, of course, is legitimacy. And our point of departure is that in order to determine effectiveness and legitimacy, it's important to assess this by issue area and by region. So if you look at climate governance, it looks different from financial governance, which in turn is different from health governance and migration and security. So assessing how the system looks within different issue areas is one very important aspect of our research. The other is the variation by region and the role of regional organizations in supporting and being a part of that multilateral system. Now, of course, when we started this research, there was less of a focus on the rivalry and undermining of this system than it is today, in large part because of the Trump administration's cuts and general behavior within the international system, which of course raises the question of how do we think about the combination of a concern with effectiveness and a concern with legitimacy, given the US foreign policy right now and also other changes going on in other regions. I think I'll end there and hand it over to our main speaker, and I look very much forward to our discussions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ole Jakob. Just a quick note, for those who have name tags in front of you, could you please orient them towards towards Alexandra in the middle of the table here, so that when we get to the next session and she's chairing, she can see everybody's names. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Senator Peter Beam. Prior to his appointment to Canada's Senate in 2018, he was one of Canada's most senior diplomats and foreign policy officials. He was Deputy Minister for the G7 Summit and personal representative of the Prime Minister, Deputy Minister of International Development, and Senior Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. His postings abroad included that of Ambassador to Germany and Ambassador to the Organization of American States. He was also Minister at the Embassy of Canada to the United States and Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas, North America, and Consular Affairs, among many other positions. And since becoming a senator from Ontario, he has served as chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade. He's also one of the most thoughtful and knowledgeable people I know, so I'm especially delighted to welcome him and invite him to share his thoughts about the issues that we'll be discussing today. Peter.
Thank you very much, Roland, for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Ole Jakob Sending, the University of Ottawa Centre of International Policy Studies, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, for this event today. I want to recognize at once that there is an awful lot of expertise sitting in this room as I look around, former colleagues, former ambassadors, a couple ambassadors to the World Trade Organization, which I'm sure you'll be talking about later on, and certainly I will. And so I'm very humbled to stand before you today. Professor Paris has asked me to look at a number of different questions, and in the very brief time that I have, 20 minutes, it should be sufficient to depress all of you in terms of the institutional state of the world. But I'll give it a shot, a bit of an overview as I see things. I think we have to remember that the multilateral system is something that has evolved over time. So it's not a case of this multilateral system immediately disappearing because of disruptive factors that I'll speak to in a moment. But it might require some adjustment. It might require a lot of adjustment, but we'll have to see. And when you look at the origins, you could say, well, it all sort of started with the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and how lines were drawn and alliances were established and how it was felt countries should interact with each other while maintaining their sovereignty and trying not to go to war. Also, in terms of functionality, the 19th century brought us the Universal Postal Union as technology advanced and as we went from post, mail, to telegraph, to the digital age where we are now. Warfare has had its impact, certainly in the Great War. The First World War, as it's called, led to the League of Nations. The League of Nations turned out to be a failure, not for want of trying, but because probably the most significant country went on a course of isolationism and decided not to become a member. And that, of course, is the United States. And the remainder were very Europe-focused. Then we had the next war. And out of that came a lot of work on the institutions that we have today. So the conference at Dumbarton Oaks, later at San Francisco in the spring of 1945, and then the Bretton Woods discussions led to the establishment of the United Nations, its specialized agencies, and of course the international financial institutions as well. Later on, looking at the trading world, the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization. So with that, also in relatively informal but increasingly formal regional organizations. And for Canada, quite importantly, that meant the Commonwealth. It meant the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, and more recently, the Organization of American States, where we had still have a regional presence and are the second largest contributors. The G7 came along in the 1970s after the OPEC oil crisis and has stayed with us, although the arithmetic changed. There was a G8 for a while, and then we went back to G7 after Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time in 2013. The G7 also produced the G20, which was the brainchild on the finance side of former Prime Minister Paul Martin. And then you have APEC, also an informal organization. You have the BRICS. We can talk more about the BRICS. I'm sure you will as well. And so there is a lot out there in terms of international organization, not to mention all of the specialized agencies of the UN. With international organization and institutions come rules and how these rules are applied. Also, there is a human resource component. How are these organizations staffed? And of course, a budgetary one. Who pays and how? And these are all factors that are spinning around right now as the U.S. is moving into a period of isolationism or America first, and really suggesting through actions as well that these organizations either need to disappear or they need to change in a significant way. So we're seeing the United States as a disruptor in the way that, shall we say, other permanent members of the UN Security Council have been seen in the past. And by that I mean China, the Soviet Union, which became the Russian Federation. The U.S. has turned international development assistance on its head through the dissolution of USAID, as it was known, and this is having a tremendous impact, not just on the ground in terms of human lives, but in terms of how countries will continue to work together in that particular frame. Withdrawal from the World Health Organization sends, I think, a worrying signal, and it coincides with, of course, domestic policy in the United States on health and healthcare issues. So that's kind of the overview, and went to question one that was put to me: saving the furniture, and which elements of the multilateral system can be sustained, saved, or changed. Well, there are a lot that do good work that you don't see. The media is going to describe whatever failure has occurred in the UN Security Council, but will not say that the Food and Agriculture Organization is doing really good stuff in Africa, for example. On social media, the UN is vilified, as are some of the other organizations, as being elitist or under the influence of the World Economic Forum and its maniacal leader. By the way, I've received mail saying that I'm a relative of Klaus Schwab, and everyone knows that. I've never met the man, but you know, you get things when you're in politics that you don't expect when you're in the civil service. So, how should governments focus their efforts? What would be some new structures? What could governments do? I had thought during the pandemic that, we have an inflection point now. This is an opportunity for us collectively to change institutions or adapt them to new realities. And it's not just the World Health Organization and the Accelerator Fund for vaccines and all of that, but also how the IFIs operated, because some developing countries had been on the cusp of becoming more middle-income type countries, if we can use that term, particularly in the global south, and had fallen behind. So when the G20 approved an injection of $5 trillion of liquidity into the global economy, I thought, hey, here is an opportunity for institutions to change. But they didn't. So what sort of galvanic shock, short of a world war, is necessary to change these institutions? Well, I think what we're seeing is the express wishes of one country, the leading economy in the world, and the country that established these rules-based institutions, with our help and with the help of other allies, saying, nah, that's not necessarily for us. You can go it alone. We're going to do what we want to do. And that, I think, is really unprecedented. So how do we grapple with this? Obviously, it's a bilateral concern for many countries, including my own. But it is, in institutional terms, a big shock to the system, with the threat of withdrawal of budget, and the like. So for Canada, we have been active, I would say, since about 1943. I've recently been mining my doctoral dissertation, which was about that, and I've written an article for Policy Magazine that reflects on this. But we developed something, we adapted something called the functional principle. And what that meant is that, to the great powers, in this case the permanent five on the Security Council, they can take decisions and whatever, but there has to be relative room for middle powers who have niche and other expertise, certainly in economic and social areas where they can make their contribution, and they should be their presence should be commensurate to the function that they can offer. So maybe that is something that we should be looking at again. I don't know, but form should also follow function. And what has happened, certainly with the UN system, is that it has become somewhat moribund. The Secretary General, who is in his last year, has made some amazing cuts. There is no real influx of young people into the UN ranks because the pensions are so large, and some younger people will get contracts, but the older people will stay behind. And of course, there will be cuts, and there will be assessments of what should be done with individual agencies. The International Fund for Agricultural Development is an example I would use. It's one of the three specialized agencies that exist in Rome. That's where they're headquartered. Does excellent work in promoting agricultural development and financing for agricultural development. But would it not fit better in a regional development bank or in that particular context? I don't know, but we should be asking these questions, and we don't. Is UNESCO and the US withdrawal from UNESCO the lost leader in a sense, or does it portend more departures from international organizations on the part of the United States? So the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, something that an organization that's been around for some time, certainly since the 1970s when it started with the Helsinki Final Act and the dissolution of the old Soviet Union later, is also under threat. But that's the organization that looks at electoral observation, which is a contribution that Canada has made over the years in various organizations, and the welfare, in particular, of Eastern Europe, and in particular now, the conflict in Ukraine. Is the U.S. stepping away from that? And if so, who can step up? International development. Norway is represented here. Always the model, I think, for us in many ways in terms of how to target aid in a useful way, how to have a relatively big spend, over 1% GDP. We struggle to get to 1.3 or 0.3 or 0.4 in terms of ODA versus gross national income. A thought leader. USAID, in terms of volume, was the greatest contributor to the World Food Program, for example. 60% of World Food Program expense in Sudan came from USAID. That's gone. So there's a famine. People are dying. How do we step up? It is difficult, and I'll explain why these things are difficult as well. We have the special case of the World Trade Organization. You'll be talking about that later, but that organization has been under stress for some time, predating Trump. But now, with tariffs used in a weaponizing way, the question is, how can this organization adapt, or will it? There's a special case of the International Criminal Court. Canada has been very active, was very active in the founding, and is still quite supportive, even though one of the judges, Canadian, has been censured or sanctioned by the U.S. government. By extension, the International Court of Justice as well, venerable, but it too has its difficulties. So the UN has to decide, in some ways, do we keep collectively all of these things going? The World Food Program, UNICEF, UNDP. How does that work, and what is the role of the IFIs in this? I'm one of the people who thinks that both the World Bank and the IMF have changed over years to meet the moment. But the moment is also complicated because there are countries that are not necessarily part of the inner circles who form and compose the BRICS, so-called, which is also an expanding group. I don't think there is a threat for them to challenge the dollar as the fundamental currency in the world, but there are plans. And when the U.S. creates a vacuum by stepping away, other countries are more than ready to step in. And I'm thinking particularly of China in Africa. So there are international treaties that some countries are not necessarily part of. There is a sense, at least by one leader, that maps are artificial lines, unless, of course, you're gerrymandering states in your own country for elections in the future. And we have, at times, existential questions. I mean, how do we all feel when we have been referred to as the 51st state, and no one can figure out, apparently, south of the border, why that somehow upsets us? How does Denmark feel when its sovereignty is threatened with the possible acquisition of Greenland, which historically the Americans have tried to do a number of times, outright purchase and also by treaty? I've mentioned the functional principle. Maybe that is something that we should be looking at. We are not going to find, hopefully, catalytic events, big wars, unless things go nuclear fast. But how are we going to change that international multilateral system? Will it require a coalition of the willing? When that term first came up, I was in Washington, and it was all about Iraq, the second war in Iraq, and whether Canada would join the coalition of the willing. No one really knew what it was. Donald Rumsfeld tried to explain it to us, but we set that one out. Now it's being used in the context of Ukraine. Thank you. So. This can't be done alone. There has to be a nucleus of countries who say, okay, we want to reform the UN, we want to reform other institutions. But to do that, and I'm going to put on my parliamentarian hat right now, you need the support of the people. And when you look at the loads of dis and misinformation that are out there, it is significant. The main media will focus on whatever has happened in the Security Council because that is newsworthy. But the good, Dan Costello and I were talking earlier, the good zombie institutions that are out there, they don't get much attention, but they're very important. So our government is about to embark on a foreign policy review. This is what I hear. There have been various foreign policy reviews in the past. Roland, you'll remember at least one. They've all sort of met strange ends one way or another and have not really influenced policy development because we think in Canada that everything is important and everything is a priority. If I want to leave you with one priority where I think everything could come together quite nicely for Canada in terms of a policy push, it is the Arctic. It is our doorstep. The Arctic Council has been moribund because of Russian actions. But in the meantime, 2 members of the Arctic Council have also become members of NATO. And that is significant. We have responsibility for over 1 million square kilometers of territory. They're populated only by about 75,000 people, 80% of which are Indigenous. So we have an obligation to do something. It is foreign policy, it is domestic policy, it is a niche, it is something where we could exercise our functional principle. So I hope I've given you a few ideas and not depressed you too much. Thank you.